At 10 minutes before 10 on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, a man in a cramped cockpit 14,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean was doing arithmetic he did not like. His name was Wade McClusky. He was 40 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and he had turned 40 exactly 3 days earlier, somewhere in the empty water northeast of Midway Atoll. Behind him, strung out across the sky in loose formation, were 33 dive bombers. Their fuel gauges were falling toward numbers that meant no one was going home. He had flown to the place where the enemy was supposed to be. There was nothing there, just water and more water and the flat silver glare of a tropical morning. Every one of those 33 aircraft carried 2 men, 66 men, and one of them had to decide when to quit. He could turn around now, and most of them would live, or he could keep going. Within 30 minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft carriers would be burning. But to understand how 33 low-fuel aircraft found the most powerful naval strike force on Earth, you have to go backwards. 6 months backwards. Because the 6 minutes that ended the Japanese offensive in the Pacific were not built in 6 minutes. They were built out of a broken radio on a coral island, a codebreaker who slept in a basement, a wrecked carrier patched together in 72 hours, and a chain of small Japanese failures that nobody in Tokyo ever saw as failures at all. This is the story of how the most successful fleet in the world went blind. Begin with what the Japanese had. It is easy, 80 years later, to forget how frightening it was. On the 7th of December 1941, 6 aircraft carriers had launched from a point north of Hawaii and put more than 300 aircraft over Pearl Harbor. That force had a name, WWII, the Mobile Force. It was not a collection of ships that happened to sail together. It was a single organism, the first massed carrier strike force in history, and no navy on Earth had built anything like it. After Pearl Harbor, it went hunting. In January of 1942, it struck Rabaul in the Bismarck Archipelago and tore the harbor open. In February, it appeared off northern Australia and hit Darwin, sinking ships in the roadstead and leaving the town burning. In March, it ranged into the Java Sea. In April, it went west all the way into the Indian Ocean and did something no one had thought possible. It attacked Ceylon. It struck Colombo on the 5th of April and Trincomalee on the 9th. On the same day as Colombo, it caught 2 British heavy cruisers, the Dorsetshire and the Cornwall, at sea and sank them both in a matter of minutes, and then found the small carrier Hermes and sank her too. 4 months, 12,000 miles of ocean. Not one Japanese carrier lost, not one seriously damaged. The man who commanded this force was 56 years old, and he was not entirely comfortable in the job. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi was a torpedo officer by trade. He had spent his career in destroyers and cruisers, in the world of surface gunnery and night torpedo attack, and he had come to naval aviation late and by appointment rather than by conviction. He was cautious by temperament. At Pearl Harbor, with his aircraft returning and his crews eager, he had refused to launch a third strike against the oil tanks and the repair facilities and had turned away. Some of his own officers never forgave him for it. He was not a fool. He was a competent, careful, methodical officer commanding a weapon he had not designed and did not entirely trust. And in the spring of 1942, that weapon had never lost, which made caution look like wisdom and made victory look like a habit. Above him stood a different kind of man. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku was 58. He was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and he was the architect of Pearl Harbor. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across the United States and looked at the oil fields of Texas and the automobile plants of Detroit. And he had come home and told anyone who would listen that a war with America was a war Japan could not win in the long run. He had also, before the war began, that he could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, and after that he had no confidence. The 6 months were nearly up. Yamamoto's problem was arithmetic, and he understood it better than almost anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, Wake, Guam. The perimeter was enormous. But the American aircraft carriers had not been at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, and they were still out there. And every month that passed brought American shipyards closer to producing a fleet Japan could never match. He needed the American carriers destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed, and soon. Then, on the 18th of April, something happened that turned a strategic argument into a national humiliation. 16 twin-engine American bombers, B-25 Mitchells, took off from the flight deck of the carrier Hornet 650 miles from Japan and bombed Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, 45 years old, a stunt pilot and aeronautical engineer who had won air races before the war and now flew the first aircraft off the deck. The physical damage was trivial. The psychological damage was not. Bombs had fallen on the Emperor's capital. The Navy had promised that this could not happen. It had happened. Within days, the argument inside the Naval General Staff collapsed in Yamamoto's favor. He got his operation. The target he chose was a place most Americans had never heard of and most Japanese could not find on a map. Two small islands, Sand and Eastern, inside a coral ring 6 miles across, 1,100 nautical miles northwest of Oahu. Total land area, about 2.5 square miles. Population, a few thousand American servicemen, some construction workers, and an enormous colony of nesting seabirds. Midway was not the objective. Midway was the bait. The logic was simple and on paper elegant. Midway was close enough to Hawaii that the Americans could not allow it to fall. If Japan attacked it, the surviving American carriers would have to come out and fight. And when they came, they would sail into a trap, Nagumo's 4 carriers waiting, Yamamoto's battleships behind them, submarines strung across the approaches, and the whole weight of the combined fleet concentrated in one place at one time. It was the decisive battle the Imperial Japanese Navy had been training for since 1905. The plan that came out of the staff work was called Operation MI, and it was a monster. More than 200 ships, 8 carriers of various types, 11 battleships, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 21 submarines, and a transport force carrying 5,000 troops for the invasion. It was divided into multiple task forces scattered across 2,000 miles of ocean, most of them out of mutual supporting distance, all of them dependent on precise timing and on the enemy behaving exactly as predicted. There was also a second operation bolted onto the first, Operation AL, an attack on the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, timed to begin a day earlier. 2 light carriers, an invasion force for the islands of Attu and Kiska, and a strike on the American base at Dutch Harbor. For decades afterward, it was said that the Aleutians attack was a diversion, meant to pull American forces north. That is not quite what the Japanese planning documents show. The Aleutians operation was largely an objective in its own right, a separate strategic goal, pursued simultaneously, which meant that Yamamoto, seeking a decisive concentration of force, had split his fleet. There is a war game story from this period, and it is true, and it is worth telling because of how it ends. In early May, the combined fleet staff ran a tabletop exercise for the Midway operation aboard the battleship Yamato. During the game, an umpire rolled dice for American land-based air attacks on Nagumo's carriers and scored 9 hits. 2 Japanese carriers were ruled sunk. The senior officer supervising, Ugaki Matome, chief of staff, intervened. The number of hits was reduced to 3. 1 carrier was refloated. The game continued, and the sunk carrier, restored to life by an umpire's decision, went on to participate in the next phase of the exercise, the invasion of New Caledonia and Fiji. That was the intellectual climate in which Operation MI was planned. Not stupidity, not arrogance in any cartoon sense. Something more dangerous, an institution that had won so consistently for months that it had stopped seriously imagining the shape of losing. Now cross the ocean. 2,000 no windows, a very different kind of war was being fought. Underneath the 14th Naval District Administration building at Pearl Harbor, there was a basement. The men who worked in it called it the dungeon. It was air-conditioned because the machines required it, which meant that in a tropical climate, it was permanently cold. There were no clocks that mattered. Men worked until they could not work, slept on cots, and went back to the tables. The officer in charge was 42 years old. His name was Joseph Rochefort, and he was a commander in the United States Navy, and he did not look like one. He worked in a red smoking jacket pulled on over his uniform against the chill, and slippers instead of shoes, because he was on his feet for 18 hours at a stretch. He had come up through the enlisted ranks. He had a gift for 2 rare things at once: cryptanalysis and the Japanese language, having spent 3 years in Japan in the 20s learning it. He was abrasive, indifferent to hierarchy, and openly contemptuous of officers he considered unserious. This would eventually cost him everything. His unit was called Station Hypo. Its job was the Japanese Navy's operational code. The code was designated JN-25. In the spring of 1942, the version in use was JN-25B. It worked in 2 layers. First, a code book that turned words and phrases into 5-digit numbers. Second, an additive book, a long list of random 5-digit numbers that were added to the code groups to disguise them. To read a message, you had to strip off the additive, then look up the code group. Hypo had neither book. They were reconstructing both from scratch, from thousands of intercepted messages, using punch card machines, pencil, and the kind of memory that lets a man recognize a 5-digit group he last saw 11 weeks ago in a different message about fuel oil. They were never reading it cleanly. On a good day, they might recover 10 to 15% of a message. It was like reading a book with most of the words torn out and then arguing about what the sentences meant. By late April, the torn-out sentences kept circling one thing. Something big was coming. There was a designator appearing again and again in the traffic, a 2-letter geographic identifier, AF. Rochefort was sure AF was Midway. There were reasons. AF had appeared in older traffic in contexts consistent with Midway. The Japanese used the letter A as a prefix for locations in the Hawaiian area. And the operational pattern, the tonnage of fuel being requisitioned, the map data being requested, the sheer scale of the force being assembled, pointed at a target within striking distance of Hawaii. Washington disagreed. This is a part of the story that is often skipped, and it should not be, because it very nearly wrecked everything. The Navy's cryptanalytic effort was split between HIPO at Pearl Harbor, a unit at Corregidor that had evacuated to Australia, and OP-20G in Washington. The relationships between them ranged from strained to poisonous. Officers in Washington, including Commander John Redmond and his brother, Captain Joseph Redmond, held that AF might be somewhere else entirely. The Aleutians, perhaps, or Johnston Island. Some in the Army believed the target was the American West Coast, and there was pressure to hold carriers back to defend it. The dispute was not academic. If Nimitz sent his carriers to Midway and the Japanese struck elsewhere, he would lose the war in the Pacific in an afternoon. So Rochefort's team did something that has since become one of the most celebrated pieces of tradecraft in the history of signals intelligence. And it began as an idea from a former submariner-turned-intelligence officer named Wilfred Jasper Holmes. Midway had a water problem. It always had. There is no fresh water on a coral atoll. Every drop the garrison drank came from distillation plants that boiled seawater. Holmes knew this because before the war he had known the atoll well. The idea was this: have Midway send a message, in plain language, uncoded, stating that its water distillation plant had broken down and the island was short of fresh water. Then wait. The instruction went out to Midway by secure undersea cable, so the Japanese could not intercept the order itself. On the 20th of May, Midway broadcast in the clear that it had a water shortage. Within about 2 days, HIPO intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that AF was short of fresh water. That was it. That was the whole of it. One sentence in a code they could barely read, and the argument was over. AF was Midway. Now the Americans had a target. What they needed was a schedule, and this is where the second man in the intelligence chain steps forward. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton was 39, and he was Admiral Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer. Like Rochefort, he had studied Japanese in Japan. Unlike Rochefort, he had the ear of the commander-in-chief every single morning, and he had earned it by never once telling Nimitz something comfortable when the evidence said otherwise. Layton had been the man who briefed Nimitz on the 7th of December. He carried that. On the 27th of May, Nimitz asked him to stop hedging. Not probabilities, not ranges. Where, when, and from what direction. Layton gave him a number. The Japanese carriers would be sighted on the morning of the 4th of June, bearing 325 degrees from Midway at a range of about 175 miles at approximately 6 in the morning. He would turn out to be wrong by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. Consider what was actually being claimed there. An American officer in a Hawaiian office building, working from fragments of a code his colleagues could not fully read, told his commander the precise hour and compass bearing on which the most powerful naval force in the world would appear out of an empty ocean, more than a week in advance. The man he told was 57 years old. Admiral Chester Nimitz had taken command of the Pacific Fleet on the last day of 1941 aboard a submarine in Pearl Harbor, because there was no battleship left afloat suitable for the ceremony. He was a Texan, softly spoken, white-haired, with pale blue eyes and an almost unnatural calm. He kept a pistol range and shot to relax. He did not raise his voice. He had a habit of asking a subordinate a question and then simply waiting in silence for as long as it took. He was about to make a decision that, if wrong, would end American offensive capability in the Pacific for 2 years. He decided to believe Rochefort, but belief was not enough because Nimitz did not have a fleet. Here is what he actually had in the last week of May 1942. The battleships were gone. Pearl Harbor had seen to that, and the survivors were slow, thirsty for fuel, and useless against carriers. He had no battle line, he had carriers, on paper 4. In reality, the numbers came apart when you looked at them. Saratoga had been torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in January and was on the American West Coast, working up. She would sail, but she would arrive days too late. Enterprise and Hornet were available. They had returned to Pearl Harbor on the 26th of May from the South Pacific. And there was Yorktown, and Yorktown was a problem. To understand Yorktown, you have to go back 3 weeks to a battle that has been overshadowed by the one that followed it, and which made the one that followed possible. In early May, a Japanese operation to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea had run into American carriers in the Coral Sea. What followed, from the 4th to the 8th of May, was the first naval battle in history in which the opposing fleets never saw each other. Every blow was struck by aircraft. Tactically, Americans lost the carrier Lexington, sunk after internal gasoline vapor explosions, along with a destroyer and a fleet oiler. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho. Strategically, it was something else entirely, and the reason is what happened to 2 ships. The Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku took 3 bomb hits. She was not sunk, but her flight deck was wrecked, and she went home for repairs that would take months. Her sister, Zuikaku, was physically untouched, but her air group had been shredded, and the Japanese had no organized system for rapidly reconstituting a carrier air group from a pool. Air crew were trained and assigned as units. Zuikaku had ships and no wings, so when Yamamoto sailed for Midway, 2 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were not with him. Not sunk, just absent. 2 of 6 held back by a battle fought a month earlier over a target that had never been taken. Kido Butai went to Midway at 2/3 strength, and on the American side, Yorktown had taken a bomb at Coral Sea. It had punched through her flight deck and detonated 4 decks down, killing dozens of men, wrecking compartments and rupturing structure deep in the ship. There were near misses that had sprung her hull plating. She was leaking oil in a trail that could be seen from the air. She came into Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May with that oil slick behind her and went straight into dry dock number 1. Nimitz did something that day that admirals do not usually do. He put on rubber boots and climbed down into the dock himself under the ship with the yard officers and looked at the damage. The estimate for full repair was 90 days at a proper shipyard on the West Coast. Nimitz gave the yard 3 days. What happened next was not heroism in any cinematic sense. It was 1,400 men working in shifts around the clock in the dark and the heat, in a dry dock lit by floodlights, doing the minimum necessary to make a ship able to fight and nothing more. Honolulu's power grid was load shed to feed the yard. Steel plate was cut and welded over damaged sections rather than replaced. Interior compartments that were merely ruined, rather than structurally critical, were sealed off and abandoned. Nobody repaired anything they did not have to repair to make her steam and fly aircraft. 48 hours in the dock, she was flooded up, floated out, and on the 30th of May she sailed, with welders and ship fitters still aboard, still working, riding out with her because there had not been time to put them ashore. Her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, was 53, an officer who had come to aviation like a great many carrier captains of that generation in middle age. Her air group had been reassembled out of pieces. Her own torpedo squadron and part of her fighter and bombing strength had been worn down, so squadrons were pulled from Saratoga's orphaned air group and put aboard. Men who had never flown together were now expected to fight together in 5 days. The Japanese believed Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea. Japanese aircrew had reported her destroyed. The combined fleet planning for Midway assumed, at most, 2 American carriers might be available, and possibly none in time. Yorktown would be at Midway, patched, leaking, half repaired, with a scratch air group. That is the second thing that decided this battle before it started. A ship the enemy had already crossed off his list. Now the command question, which resolved itself in the least dignified way imaginable. The natural man to command the American carriers was Vice Admiral William Halsey, 59, aggressive to the point of recklessness, the most famous carrier admiral in the United States Navy, and the man the crews would have followed anywhere. He came into Pearl Harbor with Enterprise and Hornet on the 26th of May, covered in a raging case of dermatitis. He had lost weight. He could not sleep. He had been scratching himself bloody for weeks. He was, by his own account, physically wrecked. Nimitz put him in the hospital and asked him who should take his place. Halsey named his cruiser screen commander. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was 55, and he was almost the exact opposite of the man recommending him. He was quiet, reserved, and analytical. He walked for miles around the deck for exercise. He drank 1 cup of coffee a day. He had never commanded a carrier. He was not an aviator, had never flown, and had spent his career in surface ships. He was, however, one of the most disciplined thinkers in the United States Navy, and Halsey knew it. Spruance took command of Task Force 16, Enterprise, and Hornet, keeping Halsey's staff intact, which was itself an act of considerable self-restraint. Overall tactical command at sea fell to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, 57, aboard Yorktown in Task Force 17. Fletcher was senior. He had commanded at Coral Sea. He had been criticized then and would be criticized later, and he made a decision in this battle that has been argued about ever since. Nimitz's written orders to both men contained a phrase that would govern everything. "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk." He spelled it out. They were to avoid exposing their force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting greater damage in return. Read plainly, that is a commander telling his subordinates that the ships matter more than the island. He was ordering them to fight, and simultaneously ordering them not to lose the fleet doing it. It was an instruction with a knife in it, and both men understood exactly what it meant. The two task forces sailed. Enterprise and Hornet on the 28th of May, Yorktown on the 30th. They rendezvoused on the 2nd of June at a patch of open ocean about 325 miles northeast of Midway, marked on the charts with a name someone had chosen with a straight face. Point Luck. It was deliberately the one place the Japanese search plan did not cover. Nagumo would approach from the northwest. The Japanese assumed any American response would come from Pearl Harbor to the southeast and arrive late, after Midway had already fallen. The Americans were going to be sitting on his flank before he launched a single aircraft. Midway itself was being turned into a fortress, which mostly meant it was being filled with aircraft that could not do the job. Marine Aircraft Group 22 flew the Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo, an aircraft so outclassed by the Japanese Zero that its own pilots wrote, in an official post-battle report, that a pilot sent up in one should be considered lost before he left the ground. There were a handful of newer Wildcats. There were Marine dive bomber squadrons flying obsolete Vindicators, aircraft the crews had nicknamed the Vibrator and the Wind Indicator. There were Army B-17 heavy bombers, which would drop a great many bombs from 20,000 feet during the coming battle and hit nothing at all. There were 6 brand-new Navy Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 Army B-26 Marauders jury-rigged to carry torpedoes, and there were PBY Catalinas. Slow, ungainly, enormous flying boats, unarmored and barely armed, which would fly search patterns out to 700 miles. The Catalinas would find the enemy. Almost nothing else on that island would matter. Now back to Nagumo, steaming east, and to the third and most important thing that decided this battle before it began. He was blind, not partially, comprehensively, and every one of the mechanisms that was supposed to prevent that had failed quietly in advance, without anyone treating the failures as significant. Failure 1, Operation K. The Japanese needed to know whether the American carriers were still in Pearl Harbor. Their solution was ingenious. Long-range Kawanishi flying boats would fly from the Marshall Islands, land at a remote uninhabited atoll partway to Hawaii, refuel from submarines waiting in the lagoon, then fly over Pearl Harbor, observe and return. They had done it once before. On the 4th of March 1942, 2 flying boats had staged through French frigate shoals, flown over Oahu at night, and dropped bombs that fell harmlessly on a mountainside in the rain. The reconnaissance value had been nil, but the technique had worked. The plan was to repeat it in late May, immediately before the Midway operation, to confirm the American carriers were in port. When the Japanese submarines arrived to check French frigate shoals, they found American ships anchored in the lagoon, a seaplane tender. The Americans, having noticed the March raid and worked out how it had been done, had simply occupied the refueling point. The reconnaissance was canceled on the 31st of May. So on the day Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor, the operation, designed to observe exactly that event, had been called off, and Nagumo was told nothing except that the flight would not take place. Failure 2, the submarine cordon. 2 lines of Japanese submarines were to be deployed between Hawaii and Midway, positioned to detect and report American carriers coming out of Pearl Harbor, and to attack them if possible. They were ordered on station by the 1st of June. Maintenance delays and fueling problems slowed them. Several did not reach their patrol positions until the 3rd of June, and some later than that. Task Force 16 had passed through that water on the 31st of May. Task Force 17 had passed through it on the 1st and 2nd of June. The Japanese submarine screen took up its positions to detect American carriers moving toward Midway, and the American carriers were already north of it, sitting at Point Luck, refueling. The net was strung across the road after the traffic had gone through. Failure 3, and this one was subtler. Radio silence and what it did to Yamamoto. Yamamoto's main body, with the giant battleship Yamato as his flagship, trailed hundreds of miles behind Nagumo, out of supporting range. He was under strict radio silence because breaking it would reveal the fleet's position. But Yamato had a radio intelligence section, and in the last days of May and the first days of June, it detected a sharp increase in American radio traffic and urgent transmissions in the Hawaiian area. The staff assessment was that American forces might be at sea. Yamamoto did not break silence to warn Nagumo. The reasoning was that Nagumo's own ships should have detected the same traffic, and that breaking radio silence would compromise the fleet. In fact, Nagumo's carriers, with smaller antennas and less capable equipment, had not detected it. So the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet had a piece of intelligence suggesting the enemy might already be at sea, and the man who needed it most steamed east for 3 more days without ever being told. Added up. The reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor canceled. The submarine screen late. The radio intelligence warning withheld. The enemy carrier presumed sunk at Coral Sea repaired and at sea. The American codebreakers, reading enough to name the target, the date, the bearing, and the range. Nagumo Chuichi steamed toward Midway on the night of the 3rd of June, 1942, in weather that had covered his approach beautifully. A low, overcast, and rain squalls that made him invisible to American search aircraft. Convinced that the American carriers were in Pearl Harbor, 1,100 miles behind him, and would not appear for days. He was approximately 250 miles from 3 of them. There is one more thing that must be said about that night, and it concerns a man who has been almost entirely absent from this account so far, because he was 1 carrier division down the chain of command and had no authority to change any of it. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Taman was 49, and he commanded Carrier Division 2, the carriers Hiryu and Soryu. He had also studied in the United States at Princeton, and had served as naval attaché in Washington. He was aggressive where Nagumo was careful, and he was widely regarded within the Navy as the most likely successor to Yamamoto himself. His flag captain aboard Hiryu was Kaku Tomeo, 49, an experienced carrier officer. Yamaguchi would spend the morning of the 4th of June trying to persuade his commanding officer to do something he did not want to do. He would be right. He would be overruled. And he would die for a battle he had tried to fight differently. There was also, aboard Hiryu, a lieutenant named Tomonaga Joichi, who commanded her air group and who would lead the first strike on Midway that morning. He would take off a second time that afternoon. And on the American side, in the pre-dawn dark aboard Hornet, a 41-year-old lieutenant commander named John Waldron was preparing his squadron. Torpedo 8. 15 Douglas Devastators, aircraft so obsolete that they could not carry a torpedo faster than about 100 knots, in a squadron that had never flown a combat mission. Waldron was of Lakota descent and had a reputation for insubordination in the service of getting things right. He disagreed with the air group commander's plan for the coming battle. He said so and kept saying so and was overruled. The night before the battle, he wrote a message to his pilots. He told them that if the worst came and only 1 aircraft was left to make a final run in, he wanted that man to go in and get a hit. 14,000 feet, 10 in the morning, a fuel gauge falling. That is where this began, and that is where it will end, but it does not get there yet. Because between the dark of June the 3rd and the dive that started at 22 minutes past 10, there were 6 hours in which everything that could have gone differently very nearly did. At 4:30 on the morning of the 4th of June, 108 Japanese aircraft would lift off 4 flight decks into a gray dawn and turn southeast toward Midway. At the same hour, 22 PBY Catalinas would take off from the lagoon behind them and fan out to the northwest. And on the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi, a 56-year-old admiral who had not lost a battle in 6 months was about to be handed a decision with no correct answer, and given about 8 minutes to make it. The morning of the 4th of June, 1942 began in darkness on 4 flight decks with the smell of aviation gasoline and hot oil, and the sound of hundreds of radial engines turning over in the dark. It was 4:15 when the first engines caught aboard Akagi. The sea was moderate. There was a light wind out of the southeast and a low broken overcast, the remains of the weather front that had hidden the Japanese approach for 3 days. Deck crews in colored jerseys moved between the aircraft with wheel chocks and starter cartridges, working by the blue glow of shaded lamps. At 4:30, the carriers turned into the wind and began to launch. 108 aircraft went off those 4 decks in about 15 minutes. 36 Nakajima B-5N level bombers carrying 800-kilogram land bombs, 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 60 fighters as escort. They circled, formed up, and turned southeast toward an island 180 miles away. Leading them was Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, Air Group Commander of Hiryu, flying in a level bomber. He had never led a strike of this size. The man who normally would have, Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, 39, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was flat on his back below decks aboard Akagi, recovering from an emergency appendectomy performed 2 days earlier. He would spend the entire battle as a spectator on his own flagship. Behind them on the 4 decks, 93 aircraft remained. This was the reserve, and everything that happened in the next 6 hours turns on it. Japanese carrier doctrine held that a fleet operating within reach of an enemy fleet kept half its strike capacity in hand. Not fueled and spotted on deck, but ready below in the hangars, armed for anti-ship attack. Torpedoes on the Nakajimas. Armor-piercing bombs on the Aichis. Because if an American carrier appeared, you did not want to be caught with a hangar full of aircraft carrying land bombs that would bounce off a flight deck. So at 4:30 in the morning, 93 aircraft sat below in 2 enclosed hangar decks per ship, armed to kill ships. Nagumo had done everything by the book. At almost exactly the same minute, 180 miles to the southeast, 22 PBY Catalinas were lifting off the lagoon at Midway and fanning out to the northwest on search legs. They were the slowest combat aircraft either side put into the air that day. They would decide the battle. At 5:34, one of them found something. Lieutenant Howard Adey, flying a Catalina at the far end of his search leg, came out of a cloud and saw ships below him. He sent a contact report. 11 minutes later, another Catalina, flown by Lieutenant William Chase, sent the words that Midway had been waiting 8 days to hear. Many planes heading Midway. And at 6:03, Adey reported the thing itself. 2 carriers and battleships, bearing 320 from Midway. Distance 180 miles. Course 135. Speed 25. 2 carriers, not 4. He had seen through a hole in the cloud. But the position was right. The bearing was right. The time was right. 10 days earlier, in an office at Pearl Harbor, Edwin Layton had told Chester Nimitz that the Japanese would appear on the morning of the 4th of June, bearing 325 at 175 miles. Layton had said 6 o'clock. The report came in at 3 minutes past. Aboard Yorktown, Frank Jack Fletcher had the report by 6:07. He turned his force southwest and gave the order that started the American attack. Spruance was to proceed southwest with Task Force 60 and strike the enemy carriers as soon as definitely located. Fletcher would follow with Yorktown as soon as he recovered his own morning search aircraft. That last part matters more than it sounds. Fletcher held Yorktown back deliberately, waiting to recover his scouts and keeping half his own air group in reserve, because 2 Japanese carriers had been reported and the intelligence said 4. 2 were unaccounted for. He was not going to throw everything at a target when he did not know where the rest of the enemy was. He has been criticized for that ever since. It was also judged strictly correct. Midway was awake now. Every aircraft on the atoll that could fly was ordered off the ground for one simple reason. Aircraft caught on the ground burn. The B-17s that had been sent out earlier were recalled and redirected. The bombers scrambled north to attack. And 25 Marine fighters climbed to meet the incoming strike. 20 of those 25 were Brewster Buffaloes. What happened next took about 20 minutes. The Marines of VMF 221, led by Major Floyd Parks, 35, intercepted Tomonaga's formation about 30 miles out. They made one firing pass at the bombers. Then 36 Zeros came down on them from above. The Buffalo was slower than the Zero, less maneuverable than the Zero, and outclimbed by the Zero. Its pilots had been telling Washington this for months. Of the 25 fighters that went up, 15 were shot down. Most of the survivors were damaged beyond repair. Major Parks was killed. Captain Kirk Armistead, who led the 2nd Division, got back. Most of his men did not. One squadron report written afterwards stated, in the flat language of an official document, that the F-2A3 was not a combat aircraft, that it was inferior to the Zero in every respect, and that any commander ordering pilots into combat in one should consider the pilot lost before takeoff. 13 men of that squadron died in 20 minutes over their own island. The Japanese strike came in at 6:30 and worked over Midway for about 20 minutes. They hit the powerhouse on Eastern Island. They hit the oil tanks on Sand Island and set them burning, sending a column of black smoke 1,000 feet up. They hit the seaplane hangar. They hit the mess hall. They did not hit the runways. American anti-aircraft fire was heavy and accurate, and it cost Tomonaga 11 aircraft destroyed, and many more damaged, including his own, which took a hit in the left-wing fuel tank. And at 7 o'clock, as he turned for home, Tomonaga sent a message to Nagumo that was accurate, professionally correct, and catastrophic. There is need for a second attack wave. He was right. The runways were intact. The island was still functional. Any invasion on the 5th or 6th would run into an operational airbase. He was also, without any way of knowing it, handing Nagumo the first half of the worst decision of the Pacific War. Because while the Japanese were bombing Midway, Midway had been hitting back. Between about 7 and 8 in the morning, every strike aircraft on the atoll attacked Kido Butai. They came in waves, without coordination, without fighter escort, because there were no fighters left to escort them. 4 Army B-26 Marauders with torpedoes slung underneath. 6 brand-new Navy TBF Avengers from a detachment of Torpedo 8 that had been left behind at Pearl Harbor when the rest of the squadron went aboard Hornet. Of those 10 aircraft, 7 were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. One B-26 badly damaged came so low across Akagi that it very nearly flew into the carrier's island. Some Japanese witnesses believed the pilot had deliberately tried to crash into the bridge. Whether he had or not, the aircraft passed close enough that men on the flag bridge dropped to the deck. Nagumo was standing there when it happened. Then came the Marines. Major Lofton Henderson, 39, led 16 Dauntless dive bombers from VMSB 241. His pilots were so inexperienced in the aircraft that he judged them incapable of a proper high-angle dive, so he took them in on a shallow glide instead, which is the slowest and most exposed way to attack a warship in existence. 8 of the 16 were shot down. Henderson was among the first, hit and burning, and he flew his aircraft down into the sea. 2 months later, when the Marines took an airfield on an island called Guadalcanal, they named it Henderson Field. The B-17s came, 15 of them, bombing from 20,000 feet. From that altitude, against ships making 30 knots and turning hard, they had essentially no chance. They scored nothing. Their crews reported hits in good faith because from 4 miles up a near miss and a hit look identical. Then 11 Vindicators under Major Benjamin Norris attacked the battleship Haruna. No hits. Added up, something like 52 aircraft from Midway attacked Kido Butai between 7 and 8 in the morning. They lost roughly half their number. They did not score a single hit on a single Japanese ship. And every American officer who has ever looked at those numbers has drawn the same conclusion, and it is not the obvious one. Those attacks did not fail. They kept the Japanese fleet turning at high speed, unable to conduct steady flight operations for the better part of an hour. They kept the Japanese combat air patrol airborne and burning fuel and ammunition. And above all, they convinced Nagumo of something. They convinced him that Midway was still dangerous and had to be hit again. At 7:15 in the morning, Nagumo Chuichi gave the order. The reserve aircraft, the 93 aircraft below in the hangars, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against ships, were to be rearmed with land bombs for a second strike on Midway. This is the decision. This is the hinge of the battle. And here is the part that most retellings get wrong. Nagumo was not being careless. He was executing a doctrinally correct response to the information in front of him. He had launched a search. It had found nothing. His strike leader was telling him the island needed a second blow. Midway's aircraft were attacking him at that very moment, which proved the island was operational. He had no reported enemy carriers. Under those conditions, the manual said the arming began immediately. In the hangar decks of Akagi and Kaga, ordnance crews began the slow physical labor of removing torpedoes from Nakajima B-5Ns. A Type 91 aerial torpedo weighs about 800 kilograms. It has to be lowered on a trolley wheeled clear and struck down to the magazine on an ammunition elevator. Then a land bomb has to be brought up, wheeled into place, and hoisted. For a full squadron of 18 aircraft in the confined space of an enclosed hangar deck, this is roughly 90 minutes of work. The crews had been at it for 13 minutes when the message arrived. At 7:28, a scout aircraft reported 10 enemy surface ships, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150, speed more than 20 knots. The aircraft was a Type 0 reconnaissance float plane. It had launched from the heavy cruiser Tone, and it had launched 30 minutes late. The Japanese search plan that morning has been called inadequate, and it was, but the specific failure was mechanical. 7 aircraft were assigned to search 7 sectors along a single-phase pattern. Tone's No. 4 aircraft, assigned to the sector that ran directly through the American position, had catapult trouble. It got off around 5 o'clock instead of 4:30. 30 minutes. Had it launched on time, it would have flown over Task Force 16 at roughly the moment Tomonaga's strike was reaching Midway. and Nagumo would have known there were American carriers to the northeast before he ever gave the 7:15 order. Instead, the report reached him 13 minutes after that order. And the report was almost useless. 10 ships, no ship types. No mention of a carrier. Bearing and distance, and nothing else. Nagumo now had to decide whether 10 unidentified ships were worth reversing a rearming operation already in progress. At 7:45, he split the difference and did the only sensible thing. He suspended the rearming, stopped striking the torpedoes below. Hold what has already been changed. And he sent a query to Tone Scout, in language that has not lost any of its urgency in 80 years. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. The floatplane's pilot did not answer for 15 minutes. When he did at 8:09, he reported 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carrier. For a few more minutes, the world looked survivable. Then at 8:20 came the correction. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. That single sentence, arriving on the flag bridge of Akagi at 20 past 8 in the morning, changed everything. There was an American carrier 200 miles away. And Nagumo's 93 reserve aircraft were in the worst possible condition. Some still had torpedoes. Some had been changed to land bombs. Some were in mid-change with nothing attached at all. And the ordnance that had been removed had not been struck down to the magazines, because the crews had been working at speed, and the magazine elevators were slow, and there was no time. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were lying on the hangar decks, secured on trolleys, next to aircraft with fuel in their tanks. This is the condition that would kill 3 carriers. But it was not, in itself, the fatal error. What happened in the next 50 minutes was, at 8:30, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tama, aboard here, sent Nagumo a signal by blinker light. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Yamaguchi had aircraft ready. Hiryu and Soryu had dive bombers below armed with land bombs, and Soryu had a handful of aircraft that could go now. Not a coordinated strike, not an escorted one, but something. In the air, heading for the American carrier, right now. Nagumo said no, and it is important to understand why, because the reasons were real. First, Tomonaga's Midway strike was overhead. 108 aircraft minus 11 shot down, many damaged, some with wounded aboard. All of them low on fuel after a 360-mile round trip and 20 minutes over a defended target. They had been circling since around 8 o'clock. If Nagumo turned his decks over to launching a strike, those aircraft would go into the sea. Not some of them, most of them. He would lose half his air strength and the men who flew it, to save perhaps 40 minutes. Second, carrier. Doctrine was built on the massed, coordinated, escorted strike. A piecemeal launch of unescorted dive bombers against a defended carrier was, in the Japanese view, throwing men away. They had just spent an hour watching the Americans do exactly that, and they had watched the Americans lose half their aircraft and hit nothing. Third, escort. His Zeros were airborne and fighting. Committing an unescorted strike meant sending bombers to die, so at 8:37, Nagumo began recovering aircraft. For the next 41 minutes, 4 Japanese carriers took aircraft aboard. Tomonaga's survivors came in one after another, some shot up, some with wounded, one ditching alongside. Meanwhile, below, the ordnance crews reversed themselves a second time, pulling land bombs off and putting torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back on. The recovery finished at 9:18. At that moment, Nagumo had the situation back under control. His decks were clear. His aircraft were aboard. His hangars held a full anti-ship strike coming together. He turned his fleet from southeast to a course of 070 northeast to close the American position and worked up to 30 knots. He planned to launch a full, coordinated, escorted strike of about 90 aircraft at approximately 10:30. He had just given the Americans 70 minutes. Now go back an hour and a half to the American flight decks, because what happened there was not competence. It was chaos that happened to work. At 7 o'clock, Spruance began launching from Enterprise and Hornet. His chief of staff, Captain Miles Browning, had urged an early strike, arguing that if they launched now, they would catch the Japanese decks full of returning aircraft. The launch took an hour and 6 minutes. 67 dive bombers, 29 torpedo bombers, 20 fighters. The Dauntlesses launched first and circled, burning fuel, waiting for the torpedo squadrons. Then Spruance did something painful. He ordered the dive bombers to depart without waiting for the rest. They went out in fragments. And the fragmentation cost lives in a way no one could have predicted. Hornet's Air Group, 34 dive bombers and 10 fighters under Commander Stanhope Ring, 39, flew a heading of 265 degrees, almost due west. The Japanese were to the southwest. Why Ring flew that heading is one of the enduring arguments of the battle. What is certain is what happened. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 41, commanding Torpedo 8, had disagreed with the plan before takeoff and said so loudly in a squadron-ready room. In the air, he broke radio silence and argued with his air group commander. Then he turned his 15 aircraft southwest and left the formation. Ring continued west with the dive bombers and the fighters. They found nothing. Hornets dive bombers flew to the limit and turned back, some landing at Midway, some ditching. All 10 of Hornets escorting Wildcats ran out of fuel and went into the water. 2 pilots were never recovered. 34 aircraft from an American fleet carrier in the most important battle of the Pacific War took no part in it whatsoever. Waldron found the Japanese fleet at about 9:20. He had 15 Douglas TBD Devastators. The aircraft was a decade old. Loaded with a torpedo, it made barely 100 knots. It had to fly straight and level at low altitude for the final run, and the Mark 13 torpedo it carried had to be dropped below about 110 knots, and from no more than 50 feet, which meant flying slowly straight at the height of a 2-story house, into the guns. There were no American fighters with them. Torpedo 8 went in alone. The Zeros came down on them before they ever reached release range. 15 aircraft went into the sea, one after another, in about 10 minutes. 30 men flew with Torpedo 8 that morning. 29 died. The one who lived was Ensign George Gay, 25, shot down after dropping his torpedo, wounded in the arm and leg, who got clear of his sinking aircraft and pulled a black seat cushion over himself for camouflage. He spent the next several hours in the water, in the middle of the Japanese fleet, watching. Not one of Waldron's torpedoes hit anything. 20 minutes later, at about 9:40, Torpedo 6 arrived from Enterprise. 14 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, a man who had crashed on landing a week earlier and was still so badly injured that he had to be helped into his cockpit that morning. He had been told he was in no condition to fly. He flew. They attacked Kaga. 10 of the 14 were shot down. Lindsay was killed, no hits. Then at about 10 o'clock, Torpedo 3 from Yorktown. 12 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. They had 6 Wildcats above them under Lieutenant Commander John Thack, 37, and Thack's fighters were immediately overwhelmed by Zeros in numbers, fighting for their own lives. Massey's aircraft was hit and burning. Witnesses saw him standing up in the cockpit as it went down. 10 of the 12 were shot down. No hits. Now the full arithmetic. 41 Devastators from 3 American carriers attacked Kido Butai between 9:20 and 10:15 in the morning. 6 came back. Not one torpedo hit a Japanese ship. If you had been standing on the flag bridge of Akagi at 10:15, you would have concluded that you had just won the greatest defensive victory in the history of naval warfare. More than 90 American aircraft from Midway and the carriers had attacked you over 3 hours. You had shot down more than 50 of them. You had lost no ships. Your own strike was nearly ready. In 15 minutes, you had launched 90 aircraft at an American carrier that had just thrown away its torpedo squadrons. There were men on those decks cheering. What none of them could see was what those dead men had done to their fleet. 3 things. First, the Japanese combat air patrol was at sea level. Every Zero in the air had followed the torpedo bombers down to 100 feet or less because that is where torpedo bombers fly. The Japanese had no radar and no centralized fighter direction. Each section of Zeros chose its own targets by eye, and for the past hour, every target had been low. The sky above 5,000 feet was empty. Second, they were low on fuel and ammunition. Zeros had been landing and rearming in 1s and 2s throughout the morning, which is itself a reason the decks could not be cleared for a strike. Third, the constant attacks had kept Nagumo's 4 carriers in continuous high-speed evasive maneuvering. A carrier turning hard at 30 knots cannot spot aircraft on deck. Every torpedo squadron that came in bought another 10 minutes of a fleet unable to launch. Torpedo 8, Torpedo 6, and Torpedo 3 did not sacrifice themselves as a decoy. Nobody planned it. There was no coordination. They arrived separately because the American attack had fallen apart in the air, and they attacked alone because their escorts were lost or overwhelmed. But between 9:20 and 10:15:35, American aircraft went into the sea and pulled the entire Japanese fighter defense down to wave-top height and held it there. And while they were doing that, 33 dive bombers were lost over an empty ocean, running out of fuel. Wade McClusky, 40, had taken Enterprise's dive bombers to the predicted intercept point and found nothing but water. The Japanese had turned northeast at 9:17, and McClusky had been given the old course. He had 33 Dauntlesses. His own group of scouts had launched carrying 500-pound bombs. Bombing 6 carried 1,000-pounders. Most had been airborne for well over 2 hours. At the intercept point, McClusky had a choice that every fighting man watching this will recognize. Turn for home now and everybody probably lives. Keep searching and past a certain point nobody does. He was a fighter pilot by background, flying dive bombers for the first time in combat, and he did not know the fuel figures for the Dauntless as well as his squadron commanders did. Some of them thought he was pressing too far. He flew southwest for a while. Then he turned northwest, reasoning that if the enemy had not where predicted, they had probably reversed course. At about 9:55, 5 miles below him, he saw a single white line drawn across the blue. It was a wake. A Japanese destroyer running north at high speed alone. The ship was Arashi. She had been detached to deal with an American submarine, the Nautilus, which had blundered into the Japanese fleet and been depth-charged for her trouble. Having lost contact, Arashi was now racing at flank speed to rejoin the carriers. She was drawing an arrow on the ocean. McClusky turned and followed it. 10 minutes later, at about 10:05, he saw them. 4 carriers spread across the sea below in a loose box, white wakes curving as they maneuvered. The whole Kido Butai laid out at 14,000 feet below him. And at almost precisely the same moment, from the southeast, 17 more Dauntlesses arrived. They belonged to Bombing 3 from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, 40. Yorktown's strike had launched an hour and a half after Enterprise's and had flown a more accurate intercept course, and by pure chance it converged on the same target at the same minute, from a different bearing. 2 carriers worth of dive bombers from 2 different task forces arriving unplanned in the same 3 minutes, over a fleet whose entire fighter defense was at sea level. Leslie had a problem of his own. Yorktown's aircraft had been fitted with a new electrical bomb arming device. As the squadron climbed out, Leslie armed his bomb and the mechanism released it into the ocean instead. 3 of his pilots did the same thing. 4 out of 17 dive bombers over the target that morning had nothing to drop. Leslie led the attack anyway, with an empty bomb rack strafing on the way down. Below them, on 4 flight decks, the Japanese were finally ready. The last of the evasive turns was finishing. The strike was assembling in the hangars. Aircraft were being brought up. In perhaps 20 minutes, 90 Japanese aircraft would be in the air heading northeast. On Akagi's bridge, the mood was confidence. At 22 minutes past 10, the first Dauntless pushed over. A dive bomber does not fall, it is aimed. The pilot rolls the aircraft over onto its back, pulls the nose down through the horizon until the target sits in the telescopic sight, extends the perforated dive flaps along the trailing edges of the wings, and rides the aircraft down at close to 70 degrees at something over 250 knots. The flaps keep it from running away. The whole airframe shakes. The altimeter unwinds so fast the needle blurs. At 22 minutes past 10 on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, more than 40 American Dauntlesses did this at the same time. The Japanese never saw them start. Kaga went first. Most of McClusky's aircraft came down on her because, in the confusion of arrival, 2 squadrons went for the same ship. 20-odd dive bombers, one after another at intervals of a few seconds, against a carrier that had just steadied on course. The first bombs missed, the next did not. At least 4 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs went into Kaga in about a minute. 1 hit forward near the elevator, 1 hit amidships. 1 landed near the bridge, and the blast and fragments swept the navigation bridge clean, killing Captain Okada Jisaku, 51, and almost every officer standing with him. Command of the largest carrier in the Japanese Navy passed in a single second to whoever was still alive below. But it was the hits into the hangar that killed her. The bombs burst inside a closed steel box full of fueled aircraft, charged fuel lines, and the ordnance that had been taken off and put back on twice that morning. There was no fighting that. Fire suppression systems were wrecked in the first seconds. Fire mains lost pressure. Men in the hangars simply ceased to exist. The fires went aft and forward through the ship at a speed the damage control parties could not walk, let alone contain. Within minutes, Kaga was burning from stem to stern with a column of black smoke standing over her. Soryu was next, and it took 3 minutes. Maxwell Leslie's Bombing 3 came down on her from the southeast, 13 aircraft with bombs and 4 without. Leslie himself leading with an empty rack and his machine guns firing. 3,000-pound bombs hit her. 1 forward on the flight deck near the elevator, 1 amidships, 1 aft. Soryu was smaller and more lightly built than the others, and she came apart faster than any of them. The amidships hit went down into the hangar and detonated among aircraft and ordnance. Steam lines ruptured. The engineering spaces filled with scalding steam, and the black gang died where they stood. She lost power almost immediately, coasted to a stop, and began to burn along her whole length. The order to abandon ship came about 20 minutes later. Her captain, Ryusaku, 48, was a man his crew loved. Sailors said he was the finest officer they had served under. When the ship was clearly lost, he went to the signal platform above the burning flight deck and stood there. Survivors later told it this way. Some of his men tried to get him off. A petty officer, a champion Navy wrestler, was sent up with orders to carry him down by force if necessary. He climbed toward the platform and found the captain standing in the smoke, sword in hand, facing forward. The sailor could not do it. He came back down and wept. Yamamoto stayed with his ship, and then there was Akagi, Nagumo's own. Akagi was attacked by 3 aircraft, not 30, 3. Lieutenant Richard Best, 32, commanding Bombing 6, had been lining up on Kaga with everyone else when he realized the whole formation was piling onto one ship while the carrier directly beneath him went untouched. He tried to signal by radio and got nothing, so he pulled out of his dive, climbed back, and took the 2 wingmen who had noticed him do it, and went after Akagi with a section of 3. 3,000-pound bombs were dropped at Akagi. One was a near miss astern, close enough to whip the ship and jam her rudder. One missed clean. One hit. It struck near the amidships elevator, punched through the flight deck, and burst on the upper hangar deck. One bomb killed a 36,000-ton fleet carrier, and the reason it did is the whole argument of this story. Inside that hangar were 18 Nakajima torpedo bombers, fueled with torpedoes attached, waiting to be brought up. Around them on the deck lay the land bombs that had been taken off during the first rearming order, and then removed again during the second, still not struck down to the magazines. Fuel lines were charged. Best's bomb detonated in the middle of it. The explosion started immediately and did not stop. Torpedo warheads cooked off inside the hangar. The elevator was blown upward and folded back. Fire spread into the fuel systems. Within 20 minutes, the fires had reached a point where the ship could not be saved, though she would not sink for another 18 hours. Nagumo Chuichi, 56, stood on a bridge that was rapidly becoming untenable, with fire below him and his flagship dying under his feet, and refused to leave. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Kusaka Ryunosuke, 49, told him that a fleet commander cannot direct a battle from a burning ship, that he had a duty to the remaining force. Nagumo would not move. Officers on the bridge argued with him. Finally, Kusaka insisted, and Nagumo went. The bridge ladders were already blocked by fire. Nagumo and his staff climbed out through a bridge window and down a rope to the flight deck, and from there to a boat and transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. Kusaka broke both ankles going down the rope. At 22 minutes past 10 that morning, Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers. By 28 minutes past 10, 3 of them were burning wrecks. 6 minutes. Now stop, because this is the moment the story has been told wrong for 50 years, and the men who fought it deserve better than a good story. For half a century, the accepted version was this. The Japanese flight decks were packed with fueled and armed aircraft, engines turning, 5 minutes from launching a strike that would have destroyed the American carriers. The American dive bombers arrived in the last possible instant. That version came from a book published in 1955, written by Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who had been aboard Akagi that morning. Akagi's own operational records show her landing combat air patrol fighters at 10:10, 12 minutes before the attack began. A carrier that is landing aircraft cannot have a strike spotted on the flight deck. The two things are physically exclusive. The deck has to be clear to take an aircraft aboard. The strike was still below in the hangars, bringing 90 aircraft up on elevators, spotting them on deck, warming them, and launching them takes the better part of 45 minutes under good conditions. The proof is Hiryu. Hiryu was steaming apart from the other 3 and was not hit. She was the readiest ship in the fleet, undamaged, with every procedure abandoned and every man on board understanding exactly what was at stake, watching 3 of her sisters burn in front of her. She still needed until nearly 11 o'clock to get her counterstrike into the air. 18 dive bombers. The Japanese were not 5 minutes from launching. They were closer to 40. The 6 minutes were real. 3 carriers died in them. The near miss was invented after the war by a man who was not on the flight deck, because a fleet that lost by an eyelash is easier to live with than a fleet that lost because 30 minutes of catapult trouble, a vague scouting report, and 2 reversed orders had left it standing still at the wrong moment. Nagumo did not lose the battle in 6 minutes. He lost it over 3 hours in small decisions that were each defensible, and the 6 minutes were only the bill arriving. Hiryu fought the rest of the day alone. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, 49, the man who at 8:30 had signaled Nagumo urging an immediate launch and been refused, now had one carrier, about 36 operational aircraft, and 3 burning ships behind him. He attacked anyway. At just before 11, 18 dive bombers under Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio went off Hiryu's deck with 6 Zeros. They found Yorktown at about noon. Yorktown was ready for them. She had radar, she had fighter direction. Her Wildcats tore into the Japanese formation, and most of Kobayashi's aircraft never got through. Kobayashi was killed. 7 or 8 got through the fighters and the anti-aircraft fire. 3 bombs hit Yorktown. 1 punched through the flight deck and exploded below, starting fires near ammunition. 1 hit the funnel and blew out 5 of her 6 boilers. 1 went down the forward elevator shaft. She lost power and drifted to a stop, dead in the water, smoke pouring from her stack. And then her damage control parties did something that ought to be remembered as long as the Navy exists. In roughly an hour, they patched the flight deck with steel plate, put out the fires, restored the boilers, and got her making nearly 20 knots again. When Japanese aircraft came back that afternoon, Yorktown was underway in operating aircraft, with no smoke. Hiryu's second strike launched just after 1:30 in the afternoon. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. Leading them was Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi, who had led the Midway strike that morning. His aircraft had been hit over Midway in the left wing fuel tank. It could not be repaired in the time available. Flying with only the right tank, he did not have the range to reach the American fleet and return. He knew this. His maintenance officer told him. Other pilots offered him their aircraft. He took his own. Tomonaga's flight found Yorktown at about 2:30 in the afternoon, running at 19 knots. No smoke, fighters up, looking undamaged. Because she looked undamaged, the Japanese aircrew believed they had found a second, different American carrier. They pressed the attack through the fighters and the flak. 5 of the 10 torpedo bombers were shot down. Tomonaga's aircraft was among them. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown on the port side. She lost all power, and this time nothing could be done. She listed over to 26 degrees. Without power, counterfluting was impossible, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster, 53, believing she was about to capsize with hundreds of men trapped inside, gave the order to abandon ship. She did not capsize. She sat there through the night at that angle, burning slowly, refusing to sink. Here you had now, with 1 carrier and a handful of aircraft, put an American fleet carrier out of the battle. Yamaguchi had been correct at 8:30 in the morning, and he was still correct at 3 in the afternoon. He had also revealed exactly where he was. Yorktown had launched a search before she was hit. At about 2:30, Lieutenant Samuel Adams found Hiryu and reported 1 carrier, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 destroyers. Spruance already had the aircraft ranged. At about 3:30, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers. Among them were 10 Yorktown aircraft that had landed aboard after the morning strike, orphans flying from a borrowed deck. They found Hiryu at about 5 o'clock. Hiryu's fighters were up and her lookouts were watching, and this time the Americans came out of the sun. 13 aircraft dove. 4,000-pound bombs hit her forward, all within about the first 100 feet of the flight deck. The forward elevator was blown out of its well and thrown against the island structure, a slab of steel the size of a house standing on end. The same thing happened to Hiryu that had happened to the others. The bombs went into the hangar, and the hangar was full. She burned all night. Yamaguchi kept her underway for hours. Engineering held. Damage control fought the fires until roughly midnight, when the fires reached a point that could not be reversed and the boilers failed. At about 2:30 on the morning of the 5th of June, Yamaguchi assembled the surviving crew on the flight deck aft in the dark, with the fires forward lighting their faces. He told them he took full responsibility for the loss of the ship, and that he intended to remain aboard. He ordered them off. He asked them to serve the Emperor well. Then he and Captain Kaku Tomeo, 49, tied themselves in and stayed. Before the crew left, Yamaguchi took off his uniform cap and gave it to a staff officer to carry home to his family. Destroyers took off 800 men. Hiryu was torpedoed by her own escorts and went down that morning. The ledger closed slowly over the following 3 days. Soryu sank on the evening of the 4th, taking more than 700 men with her. Kaga sank the same evening, taking more than 800. Akagi burned all night. Yamamoto, far to the west aboard Yamato, at first refused to authorize scuttling his old flagship. He relented before dawn. Japanese destroyers put torpedoes into her, and she went down at about 5 in the morning on the 5th of June. Yamamoto spent that night trying to salvage the operation. He ordered his battleships forward to seek a night surface action, the kind of fight the Imperial Japanese Navy trained for above all others, hoping to catch the American carriers in the dark where aircraft could not fly. Spruance did not oblige. He turned east during the night, away from the enemy, and did not turn back west until after midnight. He was criticized for it at the time by aggressive officers who wanted pursuit. He had 400 miles of open ocean between his carriers and the Japanese battle line, and he was carrying out an order that said calculated risk. He had won. He was not going to hand it back by steaming into a night gunnery action against battleships. It is one of the most disciplined command decisions of the war. On the 5th of June, Yamamoto canceled the Midway operation and ordered a general withdrawal. In the confusion of that withdrawal, two Japanese heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, maneuvering hard at night to avoid the American submarine Tambor, collided. Mogami's bow was crushed back. Both ships were slowed. American aircraft found them on the 6th of June. Mikuma was bombed repeatedly and sank with about 700 men. Mogami, terribly damaged, somehow survived and reached port. And there was still Yorktown. She had not sunk. On the 6th of June, a salvage party went back aboard, led by Captain Buckmaster, and began cutting away wreckage and correcting the list. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power and pumps. It was working. She was coming back up. The Japanese submarine, I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tanabe Yahachi, 37, had been ordered to find and finish her. Tanabe got inside, the destroyer screen submerged, ran in slowly, and at about 1:30 in the afternoon on the 6th of June fired 4 torpedoes at a range of about 1,500 yards. One missed. One hit Hammond amidships and broke her in half. 2 passed under Hammond and hit Yorktown. Hammond went down in about 4 minutes. As she sank, her depth charges detonated in the water and killed many of the men who had gotten clear of her and were swimming. Roughly 80 of her crew died, most of them from that. Yorktown stayed afloat through the night, and at about 6 in the morning on the 7th of June, she rolled over and sank in 3,000 fathoms, colors flying. The final accounting. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, Mikuma, about 248 aircraft, which was essentially every aircraft the 4 carriers carried, and around 3,057 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, Hammond, about 150 aircraft, and 307 men. So did 6 minutes cost Japan the war? No, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. Start with the myth that has done the most damage, because it is the one most often repeated. It is frequently said that Japan lost its irreplaceable naval aviators at Midway, and that the elite corps that flew at Pearl Harbor died over those 4 carriers. The records do not support it. Japanese aircrew losses at Midway were about 110 men. That is a serious loss. It is not a generation. The majority of the aircrew aboard those 4 carriers survived, taken off by destroyers, and many flew again. The men who did not get off were the others: aircraft maintenance crews, ordnance men, fuel handlers, flight deck crews, engineers, the men who lived in the hangars and the machinery spaces and the compartments below the waterline, which is precisely where the bombs went off and where the fires burned. 267 men died aboard Akagi, 811 aboard Kaga, 711 aboard Soryu, 389 aboard Hiryu. Those men were the accumulated technical skill of the finest carrier force in the world, and Japan had no system for replacing them at scale. You cannot conscript a plane captain with 4 years of experience. The Japanese naval air arm was not destroyed at Midway. It was bled to death over the Solomon Islands during the 6 months that followed, in a grinding campaign of attrition over Guadalcanal from August 1942 into February 1943. That consumed pilots faster than Japan's training pipeline could produce them. Midway did not kill the Japanese Navy. Midway opened the door for the thing that did. What the 6 minutes actually ended was the initiative. Before the 4th of June, Japan chose where and when the war would be fought. Every battle of the first 6 months was a Japanese decision. After the 4th of June, Japan reacted. The planned offensive against Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia, intended to cut the sea route between the United States and Australia, was postponed within a week and canceled within a month. 2 months later, American Marines went ashore on Guadalcanal, and from that day until the end of the war, the United States picked the ground. And behind all of it stood arithmetic that no battle could have fixed. In 1942 alone, the United States built roughly 47,000 military aircraft. Japan built under 9,000. The Essex-class carriers already under construction in American yards would eventually number more than 20. Japan completed a handful of fleet carriers for the remainder of the war. Yamamoto had said it himself before the first shot. 6 months, perhaps a year. He had been right almost to the day. The men. Nagumo Chuichi was quietly moved aside. He commanded at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, then was given shore commands, and in 1944 he was in charge of naval forces on Saipan. When the island fell in July of that year, he shot himself. He was 58. Yamamoto Isoroku was killed on the 18th of April 1943, when American P-38s ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. The Americans knew his itinerary because they had read it in the same broken naval code that had set the trap at Midway. Joseph Rochefort, whose basement had made the battle possible, was recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal by Nimitz. Washington refused it. In October of 1942, he was removed from Hypo and given command of a floating dry dock in San Francisco. He never returned to codebreaking in the Pacific. He received the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 10 years after his death. Edwin Layton stayed with Nimitz for the rest of the war and spent the following decades arguing, in print and in person, that Rochefort had been robbed. Raymond Spuntz went on to command the Fifth Fleet through the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He remains, in the judgment of many naval historians, the finest American fleet commander of the war. Wade McClusky, who followed a destroyer's wake because he would not turn around, received the Navy Cross. Nimitz later said that McClusky's decision to continue the search had decided the fate of the carrier task force and our forces at Midway. Richard Best, whose single bomb destroyed Akagi, had breathed caustic soda that morning from a faulty oxygen canister. That night he coughed blood. He had latent tuberculosis, and the injury activated it. He spent nearly 3 years in hospital and never flew again. He was 32 years old, and his flying career had lasted one morning too long. Mitsuo Fuchida survived Akagi with 2 broken ankles. He lived until 1976, was for decades the West's favorite Japanese witness to the Pacific War, and his account of the 5 fateful minutes shaped every history written before the operational logs were finally read. And George Gay, 25 years old, the only man of 30 who came back from Torpedo 8, floated under a black seat cushion in the middle of the Japanese fleet and watched 3 carriers burn. He was picked up by a PBY the next day. He lived a long life, flew for an airline, and died in 1994 at the age of 77. His ashes were flown out to Midway and scattered on the water, at the place where the other 29 men of Torpedo 8 had gone into the sea ahead of him, on the morning the war turned.